Hello everyone, welcome to Unit 2. And today we're going to take a look at four different sets of academic English vocabulary. There are three words which are contradictory, paradox, and permacrisis. And there is one phrase which is in contrast to. First of all, let's look at the first word for today. The first word is contradictory. It is an adjective and it means if two or more facts, pieces of advice, or anything else are contradictory, they are very different from each other. Some synonyms for the word contradictory includes conflicting, opposed, and opposite. And here's how you pronounce the word contradictory. 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 And here are some example sentences for the word contradictory. Number one, each group has several common yet contradictory characteristics. Number two, we compare various texts that apparently are contradictory. And let's look at some morphological derivation for the word contradictory. The first is contradiction. It is a noun and it means the fact of something being the complete opposite of something else or very different from something else, so that one of them must be wrong. The second would be contradict, which the word contradictory and contradiction are based on. Contradict is a verb and it means statements or pieces of evidence that are so different from each other that one of them must be wrong. And here are some collocations for the word contradictory. Firstly, we would use the word contradictory in front of messages, statements, or demands, like contradictory demands in this sentence here. Secondly, we would always say contradictory to something else, like here, for example. Okay, let's look at the second word for today's unit. The second word is paradox. It is a noun and it means a person, thing, or situation that has two opposite features and therefore seems strange. Some synonyms include conflicting, opposed, and opposite. And here's how you pronounce the word paradox. 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 Here are some example sentences for the word paradox. Number one, the paradox about time is that it seems to go faster as we become older and less active. Number two, there's a paradox in the fact that although we are living longer than ever before, people are more obsessed with health issues than they ever were. And let us look at some morphological derivations of the word paradox. First is an adjective called paradoxical. It means something impossible or difficult to understand because of containing two opposite facts or characteristics. Secondly, is an adverb called paradoxically, which is based on the adjective paradoxical. Paradoxically means in a way that seems impossible or difficult to understand because of containing two opposite facts or characteristics. And here's the collocation for the word paradox. First of all, we would always use the word paradox behind an adjective. In this case, curious paradox. Secondly, we would always use the word paradox in front of preposition. So here we can see paradox of. Of is the preposition in this sentence. Alright, let's take a look at the third word of today's unit. The word is permacrisis. Permacrisis is a noun, and it means an extended period of instability and insecurity, especially one resulting from a series of catastrophic events. The word permacrisis is basically a portmanteau or combination between the words permanent and crisis. One great example of a permacrisis will be global warming, which you can see these climate activists are protesting against. And here's how you pronounce the word permacrisis. 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 Let's take a look at some example sentences of the word permacrisis. Number 1. He maintains that Europe is in a permacrisis that stretches beyond the pandemic, climate change, and war. Number 2. My generation is trapped in a permacrisis with no obvious way out. Now, let's take a look at the final vocabulary set of today's unit. This is a phrase instead of a word. The phrase is in contrast to, and it means to show that you are mentioning a very different situation from the one that you have just mentioned. Some synonyms include by or in comparison, contrary to, compared with, and against. And here's how we pronounce the phrase in contrast to. In contrast to. In contrast to. Let's look at some example sentences where you would use the phrase in contrast to. Number 1. We incline to think that the latter change, in contrast to the former, represents a cognitive improvement in our condition. Number 2. In contrast to Westerners, Asians eat more rice and noodles. Let's look at some morphological derivations of the phrase in contrast to. Basically, in contrast and by contrast mean the same thing, but they are used differently. So whenever we want to use in contrast to, it usually requires a noun to follow it. In the meantime, if we were to say by contrast, it is usually followed or preceded by the subject of the sentence. That's it for today's unit. Thank you very much, and I hope you learned something new.